When did you first fall in love with computers and maybe with programming?
I had a brother, Steve Sweeney, who 16 years older than me, and at some point when I was a little kid, he went off to work in California for a tech company, and he'd gotten one of the first IBM PCs. And so for one summer, I think I was about 11, I went to visit him in California. It's my first trip away from my family just to hang out with him. And he had this brand new IBM computer, and I learned to program over the course of a few days in BASIC. I was just blown away with the capabilities of computers at the time. It was unbelievable what they could accomplish, and I was just hooked from that point onward, and very much wanted to be a programmer.
Do you remember what you wrote in BASIC? Is it video game type things? Is it like for loop, some numerical thing? What do you remember?
Yeah, it's funny. I have a perfectly vivid memory of all of the first things I learned to program.
Okay.
I have a hard time remembering people's names, but code really sticks with me. Every step and every challenge, there were lessons learned, and some of which I've come to realize were just like me getting over some learning hurdles, but other things were actually shortcomings of programming languages, uh, and the realization that there are actually better ways. And when a programmer is learning to program for the first time, a lot of what they're facing isn't the challenge of learning a new art. It's the friction introduced by failures of programming language design. And so I've constantly come back to those early lessons there as I've progressed and done more and more things, including building programming languages.
Yeah, the friction and the pain is the guide to learning in programming. Like if I were to describe programming journey, that would be marked by pain, and that pain you shouldn't escape the pain. The pain is instructive for you to understand programming languages. But do you do you remember what kind of stuff you were writing at that time? Just the early programs?
Yeah, in the early days, I wrote a little bit of everything. I wrote some games. The first game I wrote on the Apple II was since I only knew how to program in text mode, the computer would throw asterisks across the screen. They'd flow from left to right, and you'd have a parentheses on the right-hand side of the screen, and looked like a baseball mitt. And you're supposed to catch the asterisks. That was my very first game. It took about a couple hours to build and tune, and I went from there. But I built a lot of things. I built databases at different points. I built a programming language and a full compiler for a language like Pascal because I didn't know where you went to buy one of those, so I made my own. And one of the fun things of that time was bulletin boards. Before we had the internet in the hands of consumers, you used your modem and you dialed into a local phone number and connected to whoever was running the computer there. And every town or city had hundreds of these bulletin boards run by different people with their own personalities and themes. And so I spent a lot of time building a bulletin board program and learning how to deal with database management and user interface and dealing with multiple users concurrently and things. And so I don't know, I'd probably spent about 10 or 15,000 hours writing code just on my own as a kid between age 10 and age 20 before I actually shipped a program to the outside world.
10 to 15,000 hours. What was the value of the hours as a kid you put in programming that led to the success you've had in later life? Maybe this is by way of advice to younger people in terms of how they allocate the hours of their early life.
Yeah, it's not just hours, it's really striving to learn, to understand what knowledge you have, what knowledge you lack, and to continually do experiments and work on projects that improve your knowledge base. And I didn't do this with a great amount of structure or planning. I was rather just going from project to project, doing things that I thought would be fun and cool. And with each project, I learned new things. Learning about how to store and manage data, learning how to deal with advanced data structures, how to write complex programs that have deeply nested data and control flow. Each one of those, provided a lesson which were later essential. When in 1991, I released my first game, and over the course of that decade, we went from zero commercial releases to the first generation Unreal Engine. But this was largely just using the knowledge that I'd built up over the previous decade, just doing fun hobby projects. And if I hadn't done all of that work, there's no way I could have ever built the things that came later.
All the experimentation and all the exploration somehow contributed, somehow made sense later on. Like all of that is integrated somehow in the stuff you build. It's funny how life works. Like the pieces kind of come together eventually.
Yeah, there are definitely Karate Kid moments because all this time I was learning math in high school and in college. I studied mechanical engineering, and so you learn all kinds of math, vector calculus, and vector math, and matrices, and all these related fields, physics and stress and strain, and how to deal with complex physical systems. And yeah, I wasn't really sure how engineers would actually make use of that knowledge. Do you just like forget about it when you actually go off to do work, or do you write down equations on paper? It was actually not clear as an early engineering student what you do. But when I started writing the first generation Unreal Engine and I was dealing with 3D math, I was like, "Wait, I know this stuff. I learned this."
Yeah.
And, suddenly, like the Karate Kid, you get to paint the fence and,
Mhm.
wax the car, and suddenly you put all the pieces together into, a 3D engine based on a whole lot of accumulated programming language and math knowledge, often knowledge gained without ever anticipating that I might use it in that way.
Also, I think what's useful is over and over learning a hard thing and then showing to yourself, that you can do it, that you can learn a hard thing. So then when you come to having to write a 3D engine that in ways that haven't been done before, you're like, I've been here. I've been here in this experience. Like, I don't know what to do, but we'll figure it out. We'll learn. I'll learn all the necessary components. So just not being afraid of something new.
That's right, and constantly striving to make connections between these fields and look for their applications. Long after I'd shipped on Unreal Engine, it was like going back through an engineering textbook and looking at, "Oh, yeah, I use that, I use that, I use that," and then I got to this section on
Yeah.
eigenvalues, I'm like, "Don't know what the hell this is." But, it turns out eigenvectors and eigenvalues were the critical breakthrough that made the Google search engine technology work and stand apart from the rest, because they found if you threw all of the links that exist in the web and links from and to different sites, and you put them in a giant matrix and you conclude it, you found the dominant eigenvalues, then those eigenvectors described the best search results for different things. And so constantly picking up knowledge and looking for ways to put it together is the thing to do. And if you aspire to be a programmer, you've got to write a lot of code and you've got to continually learn new things and improve. If you want to be an artist, you've got to continually draw artwork of all styles and all kinds and constantly push yourself to learn more and more, because you never know exactly what you're going to end up doing in the long run. But the more knowledge you have and the more skills, the more chance you have putting it together and being successful.
And whether you're a programmer or an artist, you should probably take linear algebra, even though it doesn't make sense at the time.
I found getting an engineering degree and then never working in an engineering field, just being a computer programmer was immensely valuable. Yeah, I went to University of Maryland, which, for some disciplines, it's kind of known as a party school, but they work the engineers to death. Worked really hard, and if you learn any engineering discipline, you learn massive amounts of math, and you learn the rigor of problem solving, not just what you find from the Wikipedia article, but going through all of the exercises of solving complex problems and building up series of solutions to derive in an answer. It's valuable, and it embodies the knowledge that you need as a programmer. And, people often go to university and think, "Okay, my goal here is to get good grades so I get a diploma and I prove to an employer that I'm valuable." Like, no, that's just kind of the superficial bookkeeping of the university. The real purpose of all of this is to learn. And whether you learn formally or you learn on your own, it's the learnings that are really valuable in a career. And especially if you're going to be entrepreneurial, it's really knowing the stuff that matters and not having the diplomas and there's ever more pressure to make rebuild society more and more around credentials. Do you have this certificate? Do you have that proof? But companies that are focused on just building great products and doing great things, gravitate towards people who do the great work.
Yeah, one of the great things about youth is there's more freedom. There's just more time to learn. And people, when they go to high school, they sometimes think, "Why, I can't wait to get out of this and be an adult and be free." But it's not quite freedom. When you get a job, and you start a family, all wonderful things, but you get more and more busy and less time to learn in the general sense. Learn whatever the hell you want. And that is a wonderful time in life. The teenage years, the early 20s, the 20s, when you could just learn random shit.
Yeah, I think this is something that's kind of changing in America. There's so much focus on grades and homework and structure around kids' lives. When I was growing up, my mom would feed me and my neighbors, my neighbors and moms would feed them breakfast, and they'd, be like, "Well, be back by dark."
Yeah.
And, we'd go out and we'd play and we'd do all sorts of things. We'd, explore the woods. We'd build go-karts. We'd, salvage old pieces of electronics and build what we thought were our spacecraft control panels for the, fake spaceships we were building as play. And we'd have an enormous amount of freedom. And, from basically being a little kid through the time I went off to college, had an enormous amount of free time. And some people just use that and waste it and watch TV. Some people socialized, and some people really got into serious projects. So many people at all times were doing cool things. I was programming. I was learning to build things. I was before I was releasing games to the world, I'd be like, having neighborhood folks over to play the things I was working on and check them out. And sometimes they're impressed and sometimes they weren't. And they'd have their own projects. And often we'd have spare time jobs and everybody was entrepreneurial. Like everybody, had a side gig. Sometimes you go around and mow people's lawns, or you'd, rake the leaves up and, earn money. And the freedom there and the organic learning that occurred there, I think is something that is really critical to the American experience. I worry is increasingly going away as society is ever more protective and sheltering, and makes it harder to get these experiences.